Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's 7 o'clock or 7:02 even, so we'll begin. I know that some other of our people will be joining us shortly. I'm David Fallis, and I'm part of the group of artistic associates that is now in charge of the Toronto Consort. As lots of you know, I was the artistic director for many years, but at the end of 2018, I thought it was time to have a little change, and I'm very glad the way things have kept going with the Toronto Consort, and I'm very pleased to be part of the associates that is planning the season this year, and of course coming up next year. And from time to time, it's my turn to take artistic direction again, and this is the night that I'll be doing that. And as you know, we're going to be hearing some beautiful music from the early part, mid-17th century in Germany. And the main piece that we'll be hearing, in a way, the piece that inspired the evening, was what's known as the Schütz Christmas story. It has a rather elaborate title in German. It's called Historia Der Freuden und gnadenreiche Geburt Gottes und Mariensohnes. The story, it's interesting, this word Historia, it basically means a story of the joyful and blessed birth of God and Mary's son. And the first time that we hear a little bit about this piece is actually in a court diary. Heinrich Schütz, who is one of the most important composers of the early Baroque in Germany, worked for many years in the court in Dresden. Dresden, as you know, was a very important city in Germany at that time, still is, and it was the seat of the home city of the Elector of Saxony. This is one of these people who elects the Holy Roman Emperor, and it's an important political post. It was also a Lutheran court. It was a Protestant city, the elector was Protestant. So Heinrich Schütz worked in a sort of Lutheran situation, and these kinds of places always kept records of what went on around the court. So there are these court diaries that scholars can look at. And in 1660, talking about what happened on Christmas Day, December 25th, in the chapel to the Elector of Saxony, it says, just very simply, Christ's nativity in stile recitativo. A little bit of Italian is there. So Christ's nativity, of course, one would be celebrating Christ's nativity in some way on December 25th, in stilo recitativo. Now that's an interesting phrase, and it's also interesting that it's kept in the diary in Italian. The rest is I'm translating out of German for the rest of it. So stile recitativo means the recitative style, and recitative is the name that the Italian composers of opera gave to the way that they were creating works in which there would be sections of more musical and song-like pieces, but there was also lots of parts of the music which were almost as if the idea of them was that they were in speech rhythm, but they were accompanied quite simply. There's a whole other lecture about the birth of opera and where these ideas came from, but it was a very innovative kind of thing to set this sort of speech-like rhythm, but with accompaniment of some kind. So we don't know anything more than that, but then in 1664, 4 years later, there is a publication that Schütz must have overseen at the very least, in which he publishes parts of this Historia, this story of the birth of Christ. And so we have assumed that that was Schütz's Christmas story that was first heard in 1660. Although that's a little bit of a guess, but everybody probably agrees that that must have been what it was. Partly because when Schütz published his piece, he drew great attention to the fact that there was going to be quite a bit of this Historia, this story, which was written in recitative. He even goes on to claim that it was the first time that recitative has been heard in Germany. Now, it's true that there weren't, operas were beginning to creep out of Italy, where it had been sort of created, invented, but it wasn't exactly well established anywhere else in the world in the 1640s, 1650s. It would be some time before you get great operas in France, certainly quite a long time before you got them in England and in Germany as well. So it's interesting that he claims that he is the first one to create this style. And this is something that you're going to hear a great deal of in the Christmas story. In this publication, he says that the piece that I've created is for two groups. He calls them two choruses. Although when he talks about a chorus, he's clearly not meaning a chorus like a choir, like we think of a chorus. He really is just meaning one group of musicians and another group of musicians. And one of the groups he calls the evangelists group. And he says for the evangelists group, what you really need is an organ, small organ, a violone, which is this instrument which is lying here, and a tenor. And that's one group. While we're on this group, I'll just say a little bit. I think you probably know what these small chamber organs are like, and they have a certain number of pipes in them. They're not like a full cathedral organ because there's no pedal board, and it depends on the size of the instrument, how many different pipes you can fit in there, and therefore how many different sounds you can get out of it. But it's sort of, I'm sure you have the awareness of it, although sometimes we keep forgetting that in those days, we couldn't plug it in like this is plugged in, which creates the air inside to go through these pipes. All the organs, even big cathedral organs in those days, had to be pumped by hand because you had these huge bellows. In fact, that was for big cathedral organs where you need tons of air. If you've got 5 or 6 ranks going all at the same time, you need a lot of air, and you had to have lots of people working these bellows. But the principle of it is the same. This is a viola da gamba, and you can see it looks a bit like double bass, perhaps. It's the double bass member of the viola da gamba family. In the 16th century, the Italians were very creative in many ways, as you know, the whole Italian Renaissance and so on, and in music it was no exception. And that's when we have the first violins, and violins, right from the beginning, came in a family. The little one we call a violin, a little bit bigger we call a viola, a little bit bigger we call a cello, and it's gotten so big that we can't hold it on our arm anymore, so we have to put it down this way and play it this way, and then you sometimes get a double bass member of the violin family, so that's what we call a double bass. And all of these members of the family have 4 strings on the instrument, and they don't have frets. You know what I mean by a fret, like a guitar where you can place your finger and there's an actual little bump of some kind that stops the string, and then you know where you are in terms of the pitch. Whereas a violin, you just have to know exactly where to put your finger if you want to get that pitch. So the violas da gamba, sometimes people think that they are kind of forerunners of the violin. They're not. They arise at about the same time. They're a different kind of instrument. They're slightly different construction on the inside and even the shape of the instrument. But the most important thing is that it has 6 strings. And if you ever get a chance to look up closely, it has frets tied around it. So this is the big member of the viola da gamba, or as we say in English, a viol, V-I-O-L. And this is the instrument that Schütz says should go with the evangelist's choir. Then there's a second group, second choir, which is made up of a great, wonderful array of instruments. And so you're going to hear this sort of second choir, and it has pairs of instruments, principally. So it has 2 recorders, which I think we all know about recorders, 2 cornettos. Some of you have heard cornettos. It looks a bit like a recorder. It's sort of a curved instrument. It's made of wood. Sometimes hard to tell that it's made of wood because it's usually wrapped, covered in leather, but it is wood inside. So in some sense, it's a woodwind instrument because you blow into it like a recorder, but it has a little mouthpiece which looks like a trumpet mouthpiece, you know, those little cups. that you have in the end of a trumpet or a French horn or a trombone, and the player to play it, they have to purse their lips, and they go and sort of blow into the instrument that way. So it gives the instrument a slightly brass-like sound. It sounds sometimes like a light little trumpet. And that's a cornetto, and it was a very popular instrument at this time. So he asks for 2 cornettos. There are 2 instruments which Schütz calls violette. Well, the VIOL part, that sounds like a viol, like a viola da gamba, or maybe a violin. So it's a little unclear what this instrument is, but most scholars believe that these violette, and ette is like a little diminutive ending, a little viol, is in fact the treble member of the viola da gamba family. So we're going to have 2 of these treble viols in the piece. He also calls for 2 sackbuts. Lots of us know a sackbut is an early trombone. And he calls for 2 violins. We know about the violins. And then instruments which are playing the bass line, which we call the basso continuo, and that's organ or harpsichord. And we also have 2 theorbos, which are the long-necked lutes that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. And he also calls for an early bassoon, or a dulcian, as it's sometimes called. But it's very similar in sort of the basic mechanism of the instrument as a modern bassoon, or bassoon, and it's being played by Dominic Teresi. Some of you know him from Taffel music, I'm sure, too. So this is the group of instruments that Schütz calls for. So it's quite big. There's a lot of demands. And the way that the Historia works, the word Historia was used to tell a sacred story, and it's a bit like an oratorio, like we think of maybe Samson by Handel as an oratorio, a story from the Bible with characters. But in lots of oratorios, at certain moments in the story, it will stop and you'll have words which don't come from the Bible. They're written by a poet, and you get an aria. Or maybe some of you might even know, if I refer to, say, the St. Matthew Passion of Bach's, you'll know that there's an evangelist who is using the words from the Bible, but then there are moments when there are soloists who come and say, Erbarme dich, after Peter and so on, but those aren't from the Bible. Those are newly composed, newly written words. But in Historiae, it's always strictly just the words from the Bible, except for an opening chorus and a final chorus in the Schütz Christmas story. So it's the Christmas story literally from the Gospels of Luke and Matthew, which, as some of you are biblical scholars will know, those are the 2 principal sources of the biblical story. They don't tell the same bits. Luke focuses on the shepherds part of the story. Matthew is where we get the 3 kings part of the story. So they use both of the Gospels to be able to tell the main events of the Christmas story. And so, as you know also in the Bible, it sort of says, and there were shepherds in the field, abiding in the field, keeping watch over their flocks by night, when lo, an angel of the Lord appeared unto them and said, good news and peace on earth, good news and to people of goodwill, for unto day a child has been born, a Savior has been born. So, and then the 3 kings come up here and they say, now where is this king? We have seen his star in the east, we must go to him. And there's a story of Herod. Herod meets the 3 kings and he says, now will you tell me where the 3 kings are? So there are both characters and narration that has to fit it together. And so the evangelist tells the narration parts. This is our wonderful Charles Daniels. And then the other singers will actually become the characters. They'll become the shepherds, or the 3 kings. Or Herod calls together the high priests and scribes. He's heard that there's going to be a baby born in Bethlehem, and he says, Bethlehem? How can there be some Savior king born in Bethlehem? And they say, oh no, it's absolutely true. There's this prophecy that you, O Bethlehem, are by no means least amongst the cities of Judah, etc. So this is the way it works. It's a drama in a way, not staged, of course, but we'll have the narrator and the characters come to life. And this is where this second choir is full of the characters, and in order to portray those characters, that's why Schütz wants all these instruments. So the shepherds, of course, are traditionally associated with pipes. So when you hear the shepherds, you'll hear the two recorders. Herod is a king. So when you hear Herod, there's these duet parts for the king, and in the score, actually, it could have been trumpets. Schütz says it could be trumpets or cornettos. And as I've explained, they sound in a way similar. We're opting for cornettos, so you'll hear that, and that's supposed to sort of tell you that it's Herod who's singing. This idea of recitative, and also this feeling that one can, using the sounds of the instruments, portray different characters, is very operatic in a way. That's what opera is all about, is trying to portray in the music the drama that you're going to see on stage. So it's very interesting that Schütz was able to do this. It also suggests that there were lots of players to call on at the Dresden court chapel, and indeed there were. Some of us are students of history. We'll know that the 1630s and 40s was not such a happy time in Germany, because it was what we call the 30 Years' War, which was basically a denominational war between Catholics and Protestants of various kinds, mostly in Germany, Lutherans. And it really was very serious. It was a war. There were people slaughtered and killed and all sorts of horrible things. But that had subsided, and there was finally a peace of some kind struck. And it was in the years following that then that this piece was written for. And there was a new elector of Saxony, a Johann Georg II, who came to the position in 1656. And he was a great lover of Italian music. This could be another whole lecture. It's very interesting because, of course, I mean, opera aside, but even other the great Italian music of the 17th century in the sacred world is all Catholic. But this Elector of Saxony is not a Catholic. In fact, if he's accused of getting too Catholic, he might be in trouble, but he loves Italian music, and so he wants to have a chapel which is as sumptuous as some of the leading Italian chapels, and so he makes sure he has a whole band of recorders, sackbuts, cornettos, violas da gamba, etc., and Schütz has them at his disposal to use for this piece. In fact, it's interesting, on the title page of the publication, it says it was basically at the command of the Elector, Johann Georg, which means, I suppose today we would say he commissioned it. He paid Schütz to write it. He wanted a good Christmas story and a dramatic one to be able to use in his chapel on Christmas Day or sometime around that. The Christmas story is an interesting piece from a number of points of view. It kind of reflects something that we have to struggle with from time to time in early music. People ask sometimes about, well, where do we find this music, meaning the printed sheet music? Well, as I've said, Schütz published it in 1664, which means there were quite a few copies made. We're not talking about a run of 1,000 even, but, someone went to the trouble of typesetting it, etc., and might have printed off a couple of hundred, and some of those, and so the likelihood of something surviving is pretty good. But rather interestingly, in that publication, all he publishes is the evangelist choir. He just publishes the recitatives. He didn't go to the trouble of publishing all the rest of the music that he'd written. Now, he says, I don't think, because it's pretty easy to put together an organ and a violone and a nice singer, but a whole group of recorders and cornettos and big continuo section, etc., he says there are not that many places where one could undertake this properly. So if you would like to, you can apply to someone in Dresden. In fact, the name that's given is the organist at the chapel, who was a student of Schütz's at one point, And at his house, you can go and get a copy, a handwritten copy, of these other parts, which are called the intermedia, an intermedium, which again is an interesting word because that's a word also from Italian theater. An intermedium was a sort of break in an Italian piece of music theater sometimes. So when in the 19th century, people started putting together complete works. His musicologists got very interested in preserving what they felt was the heritage of earlier musics. So for instance, it's in the 19th century that we get the first attempts at a complete works of Bach. Before that, some of Bach's music was published. Some of it was only in manuscript. In fact, a great deal of his music was only in manuscript because most of his sacred music was only in manuscript. All those many, many cantatas that he wrote, they were never published in his lifetime. There were copies in Leipzig in the library, in his own handwriting or one of his children's, writing out all the parts. But so people said, my goodness, this is just a fantastic heritage. We mustn't lose track of it. Let's put together big volumes and publish them. So now if you go to a library, you can see the complete works of J.S. Bach, and they're many, many volumes. But they're supposed to be all there. And people then, of course, you say, well, something else was discovered or so on. So they were doing the same for Heinrich Schütz. They recognized his genius, and they said, let's put together a complete works of Schütz. But at that time, all that we knew about was these published recitatives. So if you go to the old 19th century edition of the complete works of Schütz, and you say, let's look at the Christmas story, all you'll find is the recitatives. And for many years, people thought, well, that's that. It's an incomplete work, that's too bad. But there we are. That's the vagaries of history. But thankfully, these other sections turned up in a library, handwritten, as one was in Uppsala, Sweden, of all places. Anyways, there we are. Our musicologists discovered it in about 1908. And these are these moments you think, oh my gosh, the right person was there because they looked at that and they said, I know what that is. Those are the missing intermedia from the Schütz Christmas story. And here they are. And indeed, that's where they are. And so we have, when you put together the material from Uppsala and then from the publications, which have survived in a couple of libraries, you can put together the whole work. One small point is that the opening chorus, though, and then later another version of the intermedia was found in a library in Berlin. So then you compare, and they're not exactly the same as the ones. This is what happens with handwritten manuscripts particularly. Little changes come in and you think, was that just a mistake? Or did someone really want that difference between this handwritten one and that handwritten one? Publications don't have that same issue so much, although it's interesting with lots of things. You publish it in 2000 and it's such a hit, you republish it in 2010 and it's not exactly the same as the one in 2000. So even in that sort of thing you can find differences. But it's certainly the case in manuscripts. So as a performer you have to decide which ones you're going to use. And then there's one chorus, the opening chorus, wherein neither Uppsala nor Berlin does the whole part survive. In fact, all that survives is a bass line. So we have a bass line written by Heinrich Schütz, but nothing else. So this is interesting. If any of you have recordings of the Schütz Christmas story, and you hear what we do tonight, and you go back at home and you listen to it again because you enjoyed it so much, you think, oh, that opening chorus doesn't sound exactly the same as the one we heard tonight. And you're right, because lots of people have said, oh, this is a great exercise. I have a bass line from Heinrich Schütz, and we know the words from a libretto. We know the words that have to fit in there. I'll write my own chorus, a la Heinrich Schütz. And so there's about 4 or 5 now around that you can get your hands on. So we, again, just have chosen one. And here we are for that version. As it said, it fits. They'll all sound similar because they're on the same bass line, but they won't be identical in any other way. So these are the kinds of things that when you work in early music, you sort of realize that preserving our heritage is not always absolutely straightforward. I'll just say quickly then, because I know I'm running out of time. Whenever I see Gordon walk down the aisle, I know that we're coming to an end. That's right. And I want to leave time for just if anybody has any quick questions. But the Schütz is about sort of half a program, 40 minutes long. And so we wanted to design another half. And of course, once you go to the expense and the fun of hiring all the players that one needs for the Schütz Christmas story, you think, well, let's use them in a first half of music. And there's wonderful other music by Heinrich Schütz. We know that some of them, again, were written for this very fabulous collection of players at the Dresden Court Chapel, and therefore it would be very appropriate to use them in some ways. We've used music by some of his other contemporaries, Hassler, an older contemporary, and Schein, who's almost exactly the same age as him. And in some of these pieces, we have decided who plays when. This is another joy of this repertoire. It doesn't always tell you exactly how to score the piece, which line needs to be sung, which line can be played. And that's something that, again, if you hear some of these pieces on a different recording, for instance, they won't necessarily sound exactly the same. And I sort of explain in the program, I'll let you read it, how I organized the evening, because I've designed it in a way that J.S. Bach loved, which is that the first and last pieces are almost the same text. And then the second and the second last are almost the same text. And then the third and the third last are almost the same text. And then there's one in the middle that you can really draw attention to because it's the only one on that text. So that's the way I did it, kind of palindrome style. Anyways, I know we are coming close to the end, but I just wonder if there's any questions that you would, something you heard or didn't hear, you have a question about anything, about what's to come? Anybody? Anything? Yes?
In manuscripts with words, you just have two separate copies, one of each, and you have to look between.
Yes, a good question. The question is, how does one compare these differences in these different manuscripts? Well, if you're, able to see the manuscripts, and these days it's remarkable what you can find online because, lots of great libraries are saying, this is a great resource. Let's just take a beautiful facsimile picture of it and stick it up online, and then anyone can look at it, like all the handwritten stuff by Bach, you can look at now and say, oh, I think I see something different than someone else has interpreted. There's also usually what we call scholarly editions. So for instance, the most recent scholarly edition of the Schütz Christmas story, it has at the back a whole long list. And it'll say in bar 14 in the Uppsala manuscript, it's a D, and in the Berlin manuscript, it's a C sharp, or something like that. Or the word here is this, and the word here is that, exactly what you were just saying. So you might not be laying your eyes on it, but if you want, you can compare the actual differences. I must say that I haven't done that exhaustively because it also is, we sort of went basically with one of the manuscripts, which was the Uppsala one. So there's at least it has a coherence to it. So we didn't sort of just cherry pick all the differences, but one does that sometimes if there are certain readings which you think are more likely or you just like them better, you choose that one. And but as I said, a scholarly edition will actually let you know all of the little variants along the way. Yep. Well, it is about 7:30, so I know at this point we ask that you go to your assigned seat because you've been welcome to listen to the lecture here, and then we'll have the rest of the audience in. So thank you for coming and enjoy the evening.